So I think we're ready. Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone. If you don't know me, my name's Anne. I'm the president of the Press Club. And first of all, do we have any visitors or guests today? Yes.
Hi folks. We have Jonathan Britt here, who's the current chief of the student.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Please hold your thought.
I know we have public media here.
Yeah, I'm live artisan. We're WF.
Yeah, great.
I'm only I'm
Okay, well, welcome. So we don't have much business today. Next month we are having a social event, and Betsy and the Community Foundation have very generously agreed to host that event. So it will be on the fourth Wednesday of the month as usual, but it will be kind of happy hour time. Location to be decided, but the Community Foundation is going to provide food and drink.
Yes.
So we should be very grateful for that generous offer. And they also provided with water. So, yeah. And then July, we have Jeremy Gray, who has many roles, but he is the voice of IU basketball now. The main communications person for IU athletics. And so we've suggested that he talk about the Signetti effect and how the department's handling that and how they kind of branded that whole, Signetti as a personality. And now, of course, we have the Bison. Is it a Bison? Yes, we have the Bison reintroduced, so that should be a fun meeting. We take a break in August and then come back in September, and we've got some good speakers lined up before. We hope to have them there. Bloomington, among other people, so we're working on that. We're also working on locations to meet. If you weren't aware, we no longer met the criteria to meet in the room at the Tudor Room, so we've been hoping for it. I'm hoping that in July we might meet in the Commons at Franklin Hall with Jeremy Gray, but again to be determined. So just be patient with us as we try and figure this out. We hope that one day we'll be back. So, and then Stevie's going to introduce. Yes.
Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you all here. I'm excited about the program today. Those of us who have been involved in journalism for a long time know that Indiana, for a long time, has had a pretty good open records and public meetings law, written way back when I think by Dick Cardwell with HSBA and other people who advocated for transparency in government. But the law is only as good as its enforcement, and we've often learned that public officials either weren't aware of it or weren't that sold on its benefits. So that really changed a lot with the creation of the position of the Public Access Counsel under Frank O'Bannon, I believe. Is that right? 1999. And having that a state government official who could interpret the law, advise local officials on how they should follow the law, and provide sort of his or her stamp of approval on requests for public records and for access to public meetings, which gave the officials a little bit more, considerably more legal power. It really made a difference. And so we've had several public access counselors, but Luke Britt held that position for an extraordinary 11 years and 8 months. Just reading some news stories, he issued something like 2,000 advisory opinions in that period of time, fielded 556 formal complaints about violations, issued 150 written opinions, and fielded 10,000 inquiries from the public. This is pulled from a WFYI public media story that when he stepped down. he stepped down early this year and is now a public information officer and general counsel for the Marion County Superior Courts. Some changes have taken place, and I think he'll probably talk about that with public access laws. Legislators are not always crazy about seeing the laws enforced the way the public would want them enforced. And I've had really good experiences myself as a journalist and as just a freelance writer and a blogger with the public access counselor. Luke helped me on some things. Did not always agree with my take on what records should be public, but was willing to discuss what would be and what wouldn't be, and advise public officials that, of course, it still didn't always comply at certain ones, but he's been really helpful for news media and the public at large. Important point, it's not just news media that relies on these transparency laws, but also the general public. So Luke is going to talk to you about his job and his experience and the importance of what he has done and what he does. So, for you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for spending some time with me this afternoon. It really is a pleasure to be here. Spent a lot of time in Bloomington in my youth. My college girlfriend went to IU, so I've been here quite a bit, and certainly visited sometimes here in the recent past as well. But it's always a pleasure to talk to journalists. And one of my biggest constituencies as public access counselor was the media and the press, and the relationships I curated over the years with reporters has been invaluable. And even in stepping into this new role with the judiciary, I still keep in contact. In fact, I had coffee yesterday with a former IDS reporter who's now with the Indy Star. So, and I have every intention to maintain those relationships moving forward as well. And this was always my favorite part of my job. Going out statewide, speaking to folks, listening to concerns and questions that you might have. I'm pretty informal with my presentations and my talks. I have a couple of remarks that I'll mention, but please don't hesitate to interrupt and ask me questions. Now that I'm several months removed from the role, I can be a little more casual in my remarks about my experience there. But anything's on the table. Feel free to ask. What I'd like to do really is to set the stage about what that office does, and if you're a current journalist, how it can be a resource to you, and then also a little bit of my experience coming into the role and how I adapted it to my strengths in the 11 years and 8 months. That's more specific than I remember. And talk a little bit about some big issues that popped up along the way. But please feel free to chime in anytime. I was appointed in August of 2013 by Governor Mike Pence, who I did not know, and I did not know his staff. I was not affiliated with his campaign or the Republican Party. They quite literally plucked me out of obscurity. And at the time, I thought that was strange. I got a call from a general counsel of the Department of Natural Resources who I'd interviewed with to be a staff attorney. And we had a pretty good rapport. And, he said, Luke, I think you're a little overqualified for the staff attorney position, but hey, I am moving on to commissioner. I'm hiring the current public access counselor to be my general counsel and replace me. He said, would you be interested in stepping into his shoes? And at the time, I thought that DNR had a public access counselor, and that was the role they had tapped me with. I didn't realize it was a statewide position. So I said yes, not knowing. And then before I knew it, I was meeting with Governor Pence's general counsel and his staff and navigating all of that. But the one thing that always stuck with me, being kind of, really a no-name attorney at that point, was that as I kind of evolved in the role, I realized that, Governor Pence, whatever you think of him, and that's fine. But did realize the importance of having someone objective and neutral and not affiliated with either his party or his administration or his campaign to step into that role, to be a neutral figure. Because the way the role was set up, at least initially under Governor O'Bannon in 1999, was to be just that, an apolitical resource for folks to come to because, you know, not so much then as is now, but, you know, now we have 80% public officials are affiliated with the Republican Party. So if you have a public access counselor that's calling balls and strikes on public officials and government agencies that are, you know, affiliated with that, you don't want that down political pressure coming from the top saying, you need to find in favor of my balance, you know. And through the first 11 years of that position, I never had that pressure, either from Governor Pence or Governor Holcomb. And even when I spent 6 weeks or so kind of transitioning with the Braun folks, they never told me what to do either. My biggest source of friction, and we'll get into it a little bit, was with the General Assembly at times. And there were several different reasons for that. We could talk about those, but I always appreciated, from my standpoint as an independent ombudsman, not having pressure. And I felt free to find, consistent with what the law said, number one, but also the spirit of the law as well. There were two main statutes that I dealt with. One was the Indiana Open Door Law, which deals with public meetings of governing bodies, and then the Access to Public Records Act, which dealt with documentation of the business of doing government. And whether it was that or any other access consideration scattered throughout the Indiana Code, what the law said, that was my guiding star. That was the most important to me. But the way it's written in Indiana is a little more loose. There's some gaps in the law that aren't addressed. Other states have statutes that will itemize each and every possible iteration of a public record. Indiana doesn't have that. They have categories. So a lot of my job was to kind of find through that gray area what the law should be, or what I thought a court would determine, or a trier of fact would say would be disclosable or not disclosable or confidential. And so that was a big part of my job, using the statutes as written, but also kind of coloring in the lines a little bit as to what the law should be if it was written, kind of like a judge would do. And so as that evolved, you know, I really took a lot of professional and personal satisfaction in being that sort of influence. And, you know, didn't always get it right, but I think I got the big ones right. The small ones at times, it could be tricky calling those balls and strikes. There's a lot of factors that go into a certain fact pattern, a complaint that was submitted to me, and we received about 500 complaints a year. So there was a lot of work to be done. But I think by the time I left, I could kind of look myself in the mirror and say, well, I did the right thing in following what the law said or what it was supposed to stand for, at least. When I took the position, I had been an attorney for about 6 years at that point, 7 years. I actually went to Franklin College and studied journalism. And that had a factor in my work product as well. Although I never really worked full-time as a reporter, I did some assignments as a student reporter and things like that, but I never worked as a full-fledged journalist. But it's still, I still knew, I knew the atmosphere, the environment a little bit. And the way the position came into fruition was the genesis was from the press. They approached lawmakers and approached the O'Bannon administration and said, hey, we need somebody like this because we don't know where to go when a sheriff denies us an incident report. We don't know where to go when FSSA won't give us our budget, their budget, or, you know, you name it. There was just no one to say, hey, guys, straighten up, give the information you need. It's not confidential, and to kind of hold their feet to the fire a little bit. And so that journalism background, if you can even call it that, really influenced my time in the job as well. And I was hoping that this afternoon I would get to bring down my longtime deputy, who did work for several years as a journalist. He was a reporter in radio, and he had an outsized influence in the position as well as my deputy. And he now works for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press out in DC. He is their local Indiana attorney, and that's a newly established position. About the time, about a year ago, February, to establish that. Addressing some issues that maybe the public access counselor couldn't address, or issues that need to be taken to court and to have some kind of precedent. And so he's been hard at work, kind of filling in those gaps as well. But I can't talk about the office without talking about him as well. His name's Chris Cundiff. I'm sure you'll see his name in the news soon enough. Really good attorney. We became best friends over the years. And so we still have a standing conversation every day to talk about some of these issues. Because even in my new role, I still deal with public records, just on the judiciary side. But, I found as I went along, well, first, I have to mention this as well. Someone gave me a piece of advice, a reporter, who was the very first reporter to reach out to me. Her name's Marissa Kwiatkowski, and she's now with the Knight Foundation. Just saw her a couple months ago up in Crown Point. And she reached out to me on LinkedIn as soon as the press release came out that I was going to be a public access counselor. And we had a little bit of a conversation. She said, the first person you need to reach out to and be proactive is the executive director of the New York State Press Association, Steve King. And I also can't mention my time in the office without mentioning him as well. I consider him a mentor and a friend. We talked through some really thorny issues, and we didn't always agree as well. But even our disagreements made me better. And kind of seeing around corners, adopting differing perspectives that I may not have considered, writing my mistakes and issues that maybe I hadn't thought through completely. So I consider Steve and Chris kind of my Jiminy Crickets. They were my conscience a little bit, kind of guiding me through some of the trickier issues that came to be in the office. And so I think that I can't take credit for any successes I had solely, because it was a collaboration between not only the journalism community, but also receptive public officials that were willing to listen as well. And as much tension as there can be sometimes between the press and government, there certainly is. I'm not naive to that. But public officials, I felt 95% of the time, let's say, were at least willing to have a conversation. Even if we disagreed, they'd at least reconsider some of their positions when it came to public access and government transparency. And I always also enjoyed going to talk to groups of public officials. I still do that. I have a conference next week with the Indiana Municipal Lawyers Association, who represents all of them. And they, not only that organization, but also organizations like the Association of Indiana Counties and Advancing Indiana Municipality, or AIM, they would always have me in to give refreshers and legal updates, case law updates, and things like that. And so that kind of exposure, which was not my doing, but by invitation, was really a boon to spreading the gospel of public access and transparency. Because every 4 years, you're going to have turnover to some degree. And so educating newly elected officials on their responsibilities, and it's all often a culture shock to them. When they step into office, they might have campaigned on transparency, and they almost always do, but actually standing in those shoes, having to do that work if you're coming from the private sector, it's completely different, you know? And I worked in the private sector for a time as well. And once I became a government official, my work product was not my own. It was not between myself and a client or myself and a supervisor. It was 6 million Hoosiers looking over my shoulder, scrutinizing my work as well. And that can cause a little bit of this pretty steep learning curve. And so ushering in newly elected officials was often gratifying to kind of help them navigate some of those changes as well. But no, for those of you who might not be familiar with the Indiana access laws, I'm just going to go through them real quick, but just to kind of give you a 10,000-foot overview. Had some of these, trainings and presentations that last 3 hours, but I promise not to monopolize your time. But I mentioned the two big ones, and I think that just having that as a foundation for a journalist is essential for not only the government beat, but also just engaging with your community and your government as well. We have a mechanism in Indiana called the Open Door Law, and that gives the right to anyone in the public, the press, community members, other public officials, to sit and observe the work done by governing bodies. Governing bodies being city councils, county commissioners, township advisory boards, state level boards. The law guarantees or entitles the public the right to observe that work being done. They can observe that meeting. Go and sit and watch public officials have those discussions, engage in that decision making up at the dais. Now, what we don't have in Indiana exclusively is the right to participate in those meetings from the audience. There's some of that when it comes to certain types of governing bodies like school boards and township advisory boards, that there is a right to speak at those meetings. But I always encouraged public officials to have the perspective that just because you were elected in office does not give you this mandate that just because you know more that you know better. And I would always encourage folks that were sitting up at the dais to get that feedback from the public that they serve, from their community, from their constituent. And mileage varies on that message, and it depends on context as well. But I always said, hey, if there is a practical way to have some sort of public comment forum or some sort of feedback, that makes you better at doing your job. It certainly made me better when I would hear it from constituents. Because again, you get those different perspectives, you get those different walks of life. It just makes me more of a well-rounded decision maker. And the same would go for a county commissioner or city council person as well. So I would encourage that. And by the time I left, I think there was a pretty good, some bumpy times during COVID notwithstanding, but there was a pretty good understanding amongst most of these types of governing bodies that, hey, public comment is good, even if you have to withstand withering scrutiny from an angry community member that disagrees with something you do. That's valuable as well. And on the flip side of that coin, part of my messaging to just the everyday person or journalist that wanted to engage with their governing body or their public official to say, hey, in my experience, I find that civil conversation and respectful professional engagement yields better results in the long run as well. I watched way too many videos of public meetings going sour really quickly. But and that often has a detrimental effect because then the governing body is going to be reluctant to have that feedback forum. So I would encourage both sides. Let's be the adults in the room. You can have disagreements. Disagreements are good, but do it respectfully, do it professionally. And the other statute I dealt with was the Public Records Act. And like I said, in Indiana, there are categories of records, there are types of records that may or may not exist But the importance of that is the documentation of the business of doing government gives assurance to the communities that they serve that not only are they the right person for the job, but that they're going through the steps that it takes to make sound, good decisions. And you're not going to get buy-in on the decisions all the time, of course you're not. But I would always tell public officials, don't let them scrutinize the process. Don't cut corners. Don't take leaps in logic without thoroughly explaining why you're doing what you're doing. I saw way too many meetings where, 5 minutes, they take 5 votes, there's no discussion, that's it. And then taxes are raised, or, bonds are issued, or, ordinances are passed, and the public's left going, well, where did this come from? Where did this originate, And so I think if you lay that foundation, I would always liken it to a math proof. When you're in elementary school and you do your multiplication tables and your addition, you can get the answer in your head. You can make that decision. You can write down the answer, get credit for it. But at some point along the way, the instructor started telling you, you have to show your work. You have to prove that you know what you're doing. And that's a lot like being a public official. Because you're not always going to satisfy everybody with that final answer. But show proof that you've been mindful of the decision-making process and you've respected the fact that we're going to show our work and demonstrate the steps that got us to that decision. And I think if a governing body does that, they're a lot less likely to invite that withering scrutiny, because they're not going to, and they're not, saying that we know better just because. And so that's what kind of the whole public access process needs to be. Is certainly the business transactional documents are important as well, because it also says your money that you paid in taxes that we are spending on our programming and our equipment and our facilities is going to the right place as well. I don't know if you all saw the story that broke yesterday. State Board of Accounts released an audit for a township trustee over in Bartholomew County in Columbus Township that spent somewhere to the tune of $1.1 million in taxpayer money on a township credit card on personal expenses, over the course of like 13 years. And those are the nightmare stories, because every dollar that person spent, every dollar that the government spends in general, it's not a for-profit making exercise. It comes from someone's pocket that earned them and trusted the government when they turned that money over to be good stewards of those finances. And so those type of situations, like over in Bartholomew County, all do nothing but, rouse suspicion, and rightfully so, and give government a bad name. I'm a believer in government in general, but in good, in responsible governance, in transparent governance as well. And the public records process, the open meeting process, should, in its best form, lay the foundation for trust and good stewardship, accountability. And I think that kind of accountability fosters good governance as well. So I want to pause there because I've been kind of talking at you for a few minutes and see if anybody has any questions in general. Yeah.
Yes, I work in all the time with newspaper. We are not hearing back responsibly from the person who invites you.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you might suggest as far as hearing back when we go.
Yeah. Keep emailing, because I know I've talked to her quite over the last few months, and she is completely overwhelmed. She had some issues with her phones and her email as well. And so,
yeah, but not even a response. Like, I'll get back to you.
Yeah, and it
This
might.
is good. Thank you.
Yeah, it might just be that there's a backlog.
Well,
I
heard the place a year there might be a backlog.
Yeah, I don't envy that because I don't think she's issued in 25 yet. But you know, when I took the job in 2013, I was drinking out of a fire hose as well. So I don't know intimately the details of what's going on in that
I
office.
just don't want it to be a governmental conspiracy to not respond to questions from the press that are immediate and of concern.
I haven't gotten that feeling in my conversations.
It's, but you know, the other thing is you need to speak to our local health board where they are considering limiting public comment. They become an embattled agency because of some mismanagement of things. And the president of the board said something like, I'm over it.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear from y'all. So and they don't have to, that's just it. They don't have to take the public comment. Spent my career in journalism thinking had to because most people do.
Yeah.
I cover rural counties too, but this has been surprising to be in our very liberal, open community in Monroe County.
Yeah. And I know funding has been an issue for local health boards, you know, during the session and then with some, you know, withholding of federal funding as well. But I'll reiterate what I said before, that having public comment and public feedback is often like the release of a pressure valve for frustrated constituents. And just getting that feedback, I think, makes them better.
I wrote it down. Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's hard, but it makes them better. They don't know everything.
Right.
Even though they're experts.
Right. Right. And so why not hear from the community? Serve. That would be my message to them if I was still in that role.
I know, and that's been our message to them. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My own curiosity, I have to answer it quickly with some perspective. Like, what states have the best and worst public access laws? I've always heard that Florida had really good ones, but just wondering, well, maybe you could frame it in a way, to give an example of a state where Indiana is doing something maybe better, but there's another state where maybe really.
Well, I mean, not to get ahead of myself too much, but I mentioned earlier that in Indiana, we don't have like a comprehensive list of what's disclosable and what's not disclosable. Florida, for example, has more of a comprehensive list. They've got like 700 or 600 different definitions of public records and types of records and things like that. In Indiana, there are less than 100, you know, in the Public Records Act. And so that's where an ombudsman, when I served, would make those subjective judgment calls as to, okay, it might not say that this particular type of document is disclosable, but it should be for reasons X, Y, and Z. What the biggest concern I had with some of the legislation that passed last year that was directed at that office was to remove some of that subjectivity. The law itself says that the law should be liberally construed in favor of transparency. And that word liberal is not politically motivated, not in that term. That does not mean that only Democrats get public records. And it also says that in case law says that exceptions to disclosure should be conservatively applied. Courts say that. Does not mean that, you know, only Republicans get to do it. Those are not, that is a political statement. What I think what lawmakers grabbed onto last year, and they've said it publicly, was that they thought that liberal term meant, you know, big D Democrat blue. Lawyers in the General Assembly said that, and those terms are termed way before even the public access laws were written. Those terms, liberal construction, conservative application, were terms of statutory construction. It's how the courts instruct you to read those statutes. Has nothing to do with politics whatsoever. And so I would often invoke those terms in my opinions and say, hey, there's a borderline case. And since it's on the fence, we're going with disclosure as opposed to withholding. my fear going forward is the marching orders from the General Assembly are saying you can't do that anymore. Because if you find for the Bloomington City Council, who are a 9-member Democrat council, then for some reason you're biased toward that political ideology. No. There were plenty of times I found the Bloomington City Council in violation. And plenty of times I found in their favor. It just depends on the facts as presented, and the context of those facts, and what the law says. But that subjectivity, I think, was stripped from the law. And so, to answer your question, there's a long way of answering your question. I think, I'm not a lobbyist. I don't advise lawmakers anymore, but I think that could be really damaging for access in Indiana if that stands long term. Now, a little more to your question, I can't speak intelligently about each and every state's laws as written, but I can say this: Indiana was on the forefront for having an independent public access council who wasn't affiliated with a political party, and not only myself, but my predecessors as well. And that gives some measure of credibility to that office in making those subjective determinations. For example, in Illinois, it's under the Attorney General's office, which is a politically elected official. In other states, they're organized the same way. Not every state has a public access counselor. Oklahoma considered one during their legislative session this year. It passed and was vetoed by the governor. And so I always felt that Indiana threaded the needle pretty well. Now, that said, every legislative session, there's a little bit of a chipping away at access and transparency. That's going to be the case. And then, fortunately, the courts would often come and kind of buttress the public access counselor, and the courts would say, okay, this is antithetical to government transparency. This is the way the law should be written, XYZ. And I've been encouraged over the last couple of months, even since I left office, that the Indiana Supreme Court has found in 2 different cases that agencies trying to get around public access, the Supreme Court has kind of righted the ship and said, wait a minute, this is not how the law should be. This is how it should be applied, and provided some clarity. And one of the benefits of having a public access counselor in Indiana, it's a buffer between the public and the courts or journalists. You don't have to spend $250 on a filing fee to get a judge to make a declaratory statement about the access laws. You have an administrative agency in the Public Access Council that's free, that can make those statements and have that kind of influence. Lawmakers would just say that's outsized influence because it comes from the administrative state, which it's in vogue to vilify the administrative state, right? So I thought Indiana was pretty decent comparatively, maybe up until last year.
So I want to ask you to talk more specifically about 2024, that legislation. So
Right.
was there something specific or some certain decisions that were behind the decision that your interpretations must follow the letter of the law, be strictly interpretive of the law rather than quote unquote liberally interpretive, or was it really just we don't want the word liberal in our laws? Number one. Number two, how big a deal was it, if I'm remembering correctly, that the public access counselor now serves at the pleasure of the governor?
Yeah. So I don't want to speculate on the motivations of lawmakers. I have my theories as to which opinions they found noxious, and they were all based on not the law and not the opinion as written, but in the political ideology behind it. When I looked at an issue, this is how I crafted an opinion. I did not have a foregone conclusion when I sat down to write. Kind of let it write itself. You know, how the law applies, what case law would influence an issue, and then it built to a conclusion. I think what certain politicos would say is, no, you need to start with a conclusion that is consistent with what we think, and then work backwards to try to make it. And I don't think any of the issues that they publicly stated were the motivation behind it. Yeah, it had to do with certain political ideology.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, I'll give you one that they cited publicly. It was an issue up in Hamilton County. There was a library board that met with their attorneys. It was a committee of a library board that met with their attorneys at a coffee shop, and it wasn't a public meeting. And that's all I said. It should have been a public meeting. The underlying issue was politically controversial. I did not take that into consideration whatsoever. I didn't care what they were doing at the library, at least professionally, not my position as public access counselor. Didn't publicly agree or disagree with their initiatives, whatever.
What was this topic?
So all we were talking about at the time was leadership roles within the board itself. Who was going to be president, who was going to be vice president, which I think is a matter of public interest. But the controversial aspect is they were removing books from the young adults or children section and moving them to the adult section based on their perception of the content. That had zero influence on how I found in the end. But that was one of the examples cited. And if you read that opinion, there's no mention of book rearrangement, book banning, whatever you want to call.
You were just basing your decision on
what the law says. And the law says when there's a majority of the committee that meets, it's a public meeting. Yeah. And it was pretty
But
black
they
and white.
didn't believe you, did they?
No, and in fact, there were a couple other issues that they brought up. I'll give another example. The Carmel School Board had a social emotional learning committee that was focused on those type of issues and how the educational experience would be influenced by that. And I said that committee, I can't remember, it might have even been called the DEI committee. It was back when those letters weren't as controversial as they are now, but I said that committee should be open because number one, it's committee by law. And number two, it affects the, school ecosystem as a whole. And why wouldn't parents want to be that? And my policy rationale was if you're holding these committees in secret, isn't that just going to invite suspicion and, speculation and all of that? So I said, just have it open. And if it's one of these situations where people get up and scream at you and all that stuff, maybe suspend the public comment until things settle down. Fine. But to hold that committee in secret, I thought the law did not support that. And ironically, there are Republicans who are against DEI and social emotional learning and all of that. They took exception to that opinion. I thought, well, wouldn't you want that committee out there yourselves? Isn't that part of your agenda as well to expose all of these things? So there was dissonance between what they said and then what they ended up doing. But I will say this, Steve, to your point, they did not strip the law of that liberal construction language. That's still in, which is good. Because the courts can then utilize that. So the only person who can't is the public access counselor. And the second part of your question was what happens now that it's subject to the pleasure of the governor. When I started, I had a 4-year term, served 11 years of 3 terms. And then in my last year, they stripped that language away. And I would argue that Governor Pence or Governor Holcomb, they could have manufactured a reason to fire me at any time, but I think I had their trust, and I think I earned some credibility throughout the years, and they let me do what I was doing. But I always felt like I had a little bit of insulation there to be independent and to not be influenced by those political factors. And so, if I did say something that they disagreed with, or a county commissioner who's a buddy of somebody in the administration, or a donor or whatever, that it could be removed for those reasons. Now, it could be removed for cause, of course. If I got pulled over for a DUI or something, they could have gotten rid of me, but not for political reasons. And so that was crucial, I think, in maintaining not only credibility but independence as well. And moving forward, I mean, Governor Braun might have the same philosophy on that as Governor Holcomb's and Pence did. I don't know. But I always felt comfortable knowing that I could follow what the law says authentically and not have to work backwards from a predetermined conclusion.
So we actually didn't have to wrap up at 1, so we can get the room back together by 1:15. So one last question.
I already answered. And this is kind of a specific question, relates to personal experience. So a couple of weeks ago, actually not just last week, time's crazy. There was Micah Beckwith hosted a town hall over in Ellettsville, and we had a reporter there. And at some point, about 20 minutes into the town hall, I went to relieve her of duty. She had to leave, and I went, and we were barred by the police from entering at they blocked off the road to get there. And we asked them why, and they said it was a maximum capacity issue. My reporter in there said there were several open seats. So it was a whole weird thing. They didn't let us in. I called the next day, and they said that even though the venue capacity where they were holding it in the town hall was, I think, upwards of 200, the Beckwith team had asked local law enforcement to limit it to 100 tops for that town hall. And I was just kind of curious. I had looked online if that was like a thing they could do, and it was kind of unclear. And I know this is kind of an on-the-spot specific case, but in your counsellorial opinion, is that something they can do, arbitrarily limit a public venue's capacity?
So there would be a difference between that type of town hall and a governing body's public meeting. Since the lieutenant governor isn't a governing body in and of himself, he's just a single public official, the open door law doesn't apply to those type of meetings. Now, First Amendment news gathering considerations might, that's a question for my colleague Chris Gunda. But in that context, yeah, I wouldn't have any the Public Access Council wouldn't have any jurisdiction over that. I can speak to public meeting capacities where often attendance was throttled intentionally by holding it at smaller locations. Now, I took exception to that because that would happen a lot. But yeah, I couldn't address like a political town hall like that. One more question, or are we out of time?
No, she limited. She said no.
Okay. Well, we can talk afterwards.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.